Okay, so thank you for coming. Thank you for having me. This is my first GDC, maybe my last. We'll see. It's all up to you. A couple of things. So CounterSpy was a game published by Sony that came out recently, and it got a lot of attention for its style. And I thought it might be interesting to talk a bit about kind of the process that led to that and kind of the things I learned in animation working at Pixar and how that kind of informed the game and how it's sort of informed my thinking as a designer, visual designer, and how maybe that could apply to what you guys do. Just out of curiosity, how many of you here are in the arts field, the art side of things? Whoa, wow. And other? That's good, okay. Thank you for coming. So this is a dense talk. I tend to cram a lot of stuff in. I've tried to pack it as much as I could and trim it down. But there's a bit to take in. I might rush through a little bit, but hopefully there's enough meat on the bones here you can get something out of this. So when I first caveat is I say design a lot. I'm speaking in a completely different language than what you're used to, because I think in games, design is game design. And I come more from the visual art side, where design means art, design, how things look. So try to reprogram yourselves so that you know I'm not talking about game design whatsoever. Okay, so when I talk about design, what is design? What is good design? Most of my career was spent in feature animation, or it's visual storytelling, and I love movies. And so a lot of the design thinking that I bring to what I do is sort of stemmed from what I learned in film. So that's sort of my particular bias, and I hope, again, there's some relevance for you guys. But so what is good design? We've got two frames here from two different films, The Phantom Menace and Sideways. And which is better designed? Which has better design? If you get it wrong, you have to leave. Think about it. So I'm going to be sort of explaining a bit about design, and hopefully towards the halfway through, you kind of go, oh, now I know what the answer to that question is. So we'll do a test again later. This is just your sort of teaser. Yeah, so good design is really about, in the case of film, it's about visuals that support story, and creating and making design choices that serve a deeper meaning than just making something look cool or look interesting. So that's sort of the crux of my talk. So very quickly, I started in games in '91. The CD-ROM had come out. Games, so it kind of evolved from cartridges to CD, and suddenly you had all the space for media. And so game companies previously were pixel pushed. There wasn't a lot of space for art, so now the companies needed artists. And if you could draw, if you could paint, if you knew what a computer looked like, you were getting jobs in games. Ironically, my first game company job was at Epix, which was a big company, I think, mainly in the '80s. And sort of maybe like a pre-EA even. When I worked for them, they were bankrupt. I worked on their last game. I worked with one other artist. We did all the art for the entire game, all the animation, everything. I think there were maybe one programmer, maybe two, and maybe a level designer or two. So that was sort of like during the CD-ROM boom, that was like my first kind of indie experience, which was really great. From there, I did some work with a 3DO company, which was sort of the newest entry into the console race against Nintendo and Sega. They were a local company, so I got to do some work for them. From there, I went to Rocket Science. They were kind of the next big thing in gaming, where they had married Hollywood, the best of Hollywood and the best of games, to make the ultimate entertainment love child. We were on the cover of Wired magazine, and the headline went something along the lines of Rocket Science, maybe the next big thing or the next big smoking crater. And guess which one that was? As a matter of fact, all the companies I work for are now smoking craters. Oh, actually, the smoke is gone. They're just sort of dry, just holes in the ground with like tepid water in them. So in '95, I ended up doing some freelance work with a little company making commercials. I thought there were like 10 people in the company. I was in a back room. And I kept hearing people talking about something was happening with toys, and I didn't know what that meant. Toy Story came out, and I realized, holy shit, I work for these people. And so I applied twice, got rejected twice, and it was kind of dabbling back and forth between doing commercial work and games work. And finally, on Bug's Life, so they'd been on production in Toy Story, they were wrapping it, they weren't ready to hire, plus my work wasn't quite ready. I did some work in games that kind of showed I could do what they needed, and they brought me in. Going to Pixar was a big shock going, from games. Game companies were a degree smaller. You might be working with 50 people, and now I'm working with 500. The project might be like a year and a half. Now it's 4 years. In games also, you were able to generalize. As much as you could do. I was wearing many, many hats. I was animating and doing 3D and concepting and storyboarding, you name it. And then going to Pixar, it's a much bigger machine. It's very process-oriented, and roles are very, very specialized. And that's only gotten worse over time. And also going there, working in games, I got kind of, maybe I was getting comfortable. I could do a drawing once or twice and get it approved. Like, great, good enough, on to the next. And I got all confident. And going to Pixar, I could do something 100 times, and it would just not get approved. I waited about 10 years for them to fire me. And it took that long for me to realize it's not me, it's the culture. It's a perfectionist culture. They have a very high bar. The process is all about iteration and just working it, getting the bad choices out, finding the good choices, losing the good choices, coming back to them, And so that took a lot of time to kind of learn how to work that way. I worked on a lot of films in that time, a number of roles. Started as a production artist doing character production art, set production art, graphic design. Moved more into set design. I was a graphic art director in WALL-E. I was a production designer of the short film Lifted. I was a art director briefly on a canceled project. So I've gotten to do a lot of different things there, which was nice. Starting out as a sketch artist, production artist, it's about, a lot of the concept art is about exploring options. You're trying to find the right choices. The story is evolving. Nothing's locked. And so you're working fast and loose and iterating. You're also having to communicate, as you solve problems and lock down on designs, you need to communicate that to the rest of the team who will be executing it. Modelers, riggers, shaders, lighting, and so forth. So you're doing a lot of these sort of blueprints. I took a drafting class in high school, hated it, never wanted to do it again, and I did that for a couple of years at Pixar. You're also pre-visualizing the movie, how it looks. CG is very expensive. Having a crew of all these technical directors on expensive hardware, it takes time and money. So art is really about trying to figure out how the movie looks and thinking of it contextually, how do these designs relate, how do they serve the story, and you can be making changes and iterating quickly and cheaply so that hopefully you've teased out a lot of the variables once it starts being built. Of course, at Pixar, they never lock story, so stuff keeps changing and coming back. I also worked in graphics. I was one of the only guys who knew how to use Illustrator. So kind of moved increasingly in that role. Graphics typically serving one of two roles. It's either informational, where it acts like visual exposition or nonverbal dialogue, newspaper headlines, what have you. But it also serves to create sort of details of authenticity that leads to the believability of the world. Usually you're not paying attention to those graphics, but if they're not there, the world feels sparse. It's missing some substantiating detail. And you'd notice it if it wasn't there. And they're also supporting details, right? They're not just there to look cool, they're telling a story. All the stickers in Andy's room in Toy Story 3, if you were nerdy enough to look at the Blu-ray and look at every single frame, you might be able to dissect kind of the story of the layering of stickers, where the stickers underneath other stickers are sort of like young, childlike stickers, and they kind of evolve in sophistication and interest. And so there's sort of like a bit of storytelling in terms of sort of the kind of a cross-section of his life and interests reflected in just little meaningless details. Moving into art direction, I began to think more broadly. Being in production art, your problems are very finite. How do I make this thing work? How does it look? How does it function? Art directing or production design at Pixar is about thinking about all the visuals in the entire movie, how they all interrelate, and how do they tell the story. And story, you hear the phrase "story is king." It's the blueprint from which every choice is filtered. And thinking like a production designer, which I'm kind of referring to in the talk, is about understanding story intent to make informed, meaningful design choices. It's not just about making things look cool or stand out. I mean, oftentimes good design is knowing when something should not stand out. The color script is a great tool for this. It allows a production designer to map out the design choices across the context of the entire film. It's like a storybook, a picture book laid out. And you can begin mapping design choices not just to a specific shot, but to how they flow across the entire film. And you can begin to lay out a kind of map out a design logic, which is sort of consistent, sort of visual rules for visual, consistent design choices. And thinking about how they relate to each other, both in individual shots, but across sequences, or scenes, sequences, and acts, and from beginning to end of the movie. And story is very much about change, dramatic change, characters change. If nothing changed in the movie, it'd be a very boring movie. It would probably be just a slide. So this also allows you to see how the visual choices progress relative to the progression of the story. So, for example, this color script is one of Lou's early rough color scripts. These things evolve constantly as story evolves and as design continues to take shape. This is an early one. But what he's doing, how he's using this tool, is bringing in very rough design ideas and associating them with different parts of the story. So The Incredibles, I don't know if any of you have heard of The Incredibles. It's about sort of this downfall of the superheroes. And the hero is Bob Parr, who was once Mr. Incredible. The movie opens in the golden age of superheroes. Hey, dude, nice shoes. Golden age of superheroes, and very colorful, bright. And then there's a lawsuit. Superheroes are outlawed, and Bob Parr becomes prisoner in sort of the normality of life. And so the design choices sort of represent that. So this is kind of abstract. These are visual hieroglyphics, but they're communicating design ideas. So if you look at the top row towards the left, you'll see like grids and grays and whites. And you get the impression of color kind of shifting through the film. The red colors and the greens are very dramatic, bold colors that correspond to the heroic moments of the film and Bob reclaiming his glory, trying to reclaim it. And then you've got these very reserved, white, colorless moments, which are usually representing kind of the lower points of his life. So when the superheroes are outlawed, we come back to Bob, no longer a superhero, but he's an insurance salesman or working in an insurance company. And it's the opposite of what he was. He's prisoner to mediocrity. And the visual design choices in the color script on top, again, there's grids, recurring patterns, uniformity, no color, no drama. And you can see how some of the shots from the film, how this design choice is manifested. Putting in a lot of grids, gray colors, even space is sort of boxed. Compositions are boxed and flat, so that those moments really contrast with the heroic, dramatic moments. Taking one more example of this, art directing the graphics on WALL-E. There's a sequence in WALL-E where, so WALL-E's alone on Earth. Humanity's gone. He dreams of humanity. He's alone. This other robot, Eve, shows up. He falls in love with Eve. She's taken away. He stows on board the ship, follows her, and they land on the Axiom, this giant ship in space. And WALL-E wants to get back to Eve. He has someone. He's not alone anymore, and he loves her. First realization, he comes in this place, there are other robots, and that's amazing. I mean, Eve's the only other robot he's ever seen. But now he kind of doesn't care. They're kind of getting in between him and Eve. He follows Eve through the ship. They come to another hallway filled with hundreds of robots, this whole world of robots. I mean, how amazing is that? This one little robot is in a world of robots now. He's not alone anymore, but he still wants Eve, and they're getting in the way of that. Now, remember, this guy had dreamt about humanity. He'd been longing for humanity, and now he comes into a room where there are humans. They're a lot fatter than they were, but it's almost like he's getting what he wants. But he wants Eve, they're kind of in the way. And then you come to an even bigger room of more humans. And in between these two rooms, the first one, you kind of the audience needs to know that this is humanity. This is humanity that left Earth that he's been longing about. And so how do we visually show that? And then the next space, there's thousands and thousands of humans. And we need to communicate, well, this is society as it's evolved since it's been gone. And Wally's in the heart of it. And then they continue on, and then they come to another section of the ship where it's calmer. Because Wally's going to be going up into the bridge as he's pursuing Eve. And in the bridge is Otto, the protagonist of the film, where all the conflict comes from. So there's a dramatic journey here that Andrew Stanton, the director, wanted. And he's very, very particular about dramatic how scenes and shots and sequences serve, sort of dramatic tension, dramatic arcs. So there's a very specific journey he wants here. And as a graphic designer, I had to figure out, well, how do I use graphics to support that idea? So the first thing is that the production designer, who's again, concerned about the entire movie, Ralph Eggleston, mapped out, so he looks at the boards, understands the intents of the boards, the story intent. And then, one of his jobs as a production designer in a 3D movie is to think about the space. Like, if this was a real ship, how would these spaces relate to each other? How can we have enough visual continuity and visual logic so that the audience watching it believes it's real and believes it's a consistent, space? So he kind of maps all these things together in a logical way. Then he begins to think, okay, about the design language of the space, colors, things like that, and how do they serve the story. And then he'll map out a lot of design choices in terms of, again, palettes and shape, curves versus lines versus diagonals versus brights versus dulls. And then those design choices begin to inform the actual set design. The graphic design now has to not only serve the story, it has to complement the choices of the space, the choices of the set design, in a way that doesn't complicate those design choices. So my first task was to basically think about the logic of design and how it serves that progression of story. So I did a style guide. We also didn't have a lot of time, so we had to kind of come up with rules very quickly. So I thought about, okay, well, in terms of graphics, there's iconography, there's sort of pattern, color, there's topography. And, we looked at a lot of reference material. Pixar, one of the most critical stages of Pixar, most important stages, is research and reference, and really understanding what it is you're shooting for. And it really helps to give you initial design parameters to work within, or to respond to in some way. So I pulled a bunch of reference together. We did kind of this style flow to kind of get a sense of visually, this is kind of the rough idea of the progression that Wally would go through in terms of the sort of the robot space, the human space, and then the bridge with Otto. And these were broken down into utility, passenger, and command spaces. So then taking, say, the passenger section, we did some, again, research and reference, coming up with establishing our parameters and visual touchstones. So the things I liked about this, there's sort of a clear visual branding to the Olympics artwork. I love the use of silhouette, of color. It's very simple. It's very playful. It's very gettable. And then this other period advertising art, there was a great reductivism to the visual language. It's almost like illustrations for dummies. There's sort of a visual shorthand where they're cropped out. You see maybe there's a person with a head and a shoulder, or they're missing their legs. Things are being cropped out, but you still get it. You get the essential information, and your brain fills in the rest. And I liked those ideas because one of the things we're trying to represent with humanity is that humanity on the Axiom had devolved, that they've kind of become like infants. They're these big, blobby, immobilized, infants in big floating chairs, and they're illiterate and they're bottle-fed, right? And in a way, the story is kind of about Wally teaching them how to become reminding them about their own humanity. So we go through a process of exploring, iterating concepts, sketching, iterating, refining. There might be, 400 drawings and iterations. I mean, I probably had about 3,000 slides, and I had to keep trimming it down. But these are just, tips of the iceberg in terms of the process, because there were a lot of other funny hot dogs in a cup that you would have enjoyed seeing. But anyway, so the messaging in this case of the billboards in the Axiom was again about kind of the humanity being kind of bottle-fed. And so we had lots of fun versions. We played with that. The other issue to think about is sort of context. We're designing all these things for these sort of billboards, But then how do they all work together? Because you've got hundreds of these things. I mean, this was a nightmare to design for. I'm still thankful it's done. But all these design choices have to work in aggregate. It has to make an overall statement. It can't be all these interesting things that are each interesting into themselves, and it just creates a visual cacophony where you don't know what you're looking at. So again, it's sort of being mindful of shot composition and the overall journey and what sort of visual statements you're making. So this sort of these steps kind of guided the design process. We ended up kind of with the utility section. Again, this is about introducing the sort of robot world, the sort of first sort of realization for Wally, he's not alone anymore. We didn't want to telegraph that people were on the ship. We wanted to keep it a mystery. So we tried to keep the graphics very utilitarian, very machine-oriented, a little bit more in the typical sci-fi tropes. First exposure to humans, first billboards, advertising B&L everywhere. B&L is sort of the ever-present company on Earth that basically owned everything and that put the people up in space in the first place. And so Wally, his association, and as the audience, our association with humanity was through B&L. So we're in a room now with B&L and people, so we can kind of correlate, okay, this is humanity. And this is sort of like, because this is the design language of when they left. And this was sort of a big impact moment, but the real impact moment was the next one, and we didn't want this to compete. We wanted to have a nice build-up and sort of visual complexity. So we really restrained the palettes, we restrained the animation, and I'm sorry I don't have these animating, but anyway, there was like a lot of like lateral, horizontal, vertical kind of movement, very simple. The next stage, Times Square, right? Overload. This is humanity as it is now, hundreds of years after it left Earth. So this is sort of a shock for Wally. And also, it's informing the audience as well, again, how they evolved or devolved. And so it's billboards, hundreds of billboards, tons of colors, all kinds of dynamic motion. And we wanted to have more craziness here, kind of controlled craziness. Because again, it's representing the state of mind that Wally is in. But now, we're going to be leading up to the bridge and to the bad guy and the whole sort of plot of the film. And so we needed to kind of reset the audience. When you're constructing things dramatically and visually, you don't want to keep cranking things up because people become tone deaf to it. And so you want to, like any good timing of humor or horror or anything, you want to kind of bring the audience down and kind of reset the emotional palette, and then you can hit them again fresh with something. So going to the sort of last passenger section of the ship, it was about bringing down visual complexity, having soothing graphics, and just giving Wally and the audience a chance to catch their breath. And so the graphics, I'm sorry. Catch up, you guys, come on. So the graphics represented that. There's no animation, soothing colors, soothing shapes, and you can see again how we kind of cropped out parts of the form and figure. So it's just enough visual information to tell you what it is. But it's, again, a visual shorthand for these sort of infantized, blubbering humans. So now, ramping it back up. So there's aspects of the ship where auto reigns supreme. And it's usually the command control sections of the ship. And we wanted this to be really incoherent, total sci-fi gibberish that is both playful, so it fits with the design style of Wall-E as a whole, but it's still got that kind of it's got that very computery, Star Trek-y sensibility that no one looking at it would have the slightest idea of what to do with it, except for Otto. So he's kind of in control. And Otto sort of represents sort of the robot without a soul, like just pure programming. So I began to think about, having the sort of knowledge, and these, again, these are just tiny little pieces. But I always loved films, and I began watching films thinking, well, how if I was a production designing the film, how would I look at this? I began to really pay close attention to every little design choice in films. I mean, I would literally sit there, put a CD in my computer, turn off the sound, and just go frame by frame, like an idiot. But I found a lot of interesting stuff. And this is just a little bit of a quick teaser to sort of show a couple of sort of principles that I've kind of learned and tried to think about. So one is sort of, it doesn't matter what you're trying to say if you can't say it clearly. It doesn't matter if you can't say clearly. So some examples here. So we have this little movie called Star Wars that well, look at these shots for a minute, and if you squint your eyes a little bit, what are you seeing? This iconic shot of Darth Vader is like, it's almost textbook academia, like the most obvious tricks to have a very clear composition. But it works. You got one dude in black clothes, an entire white room with white people, center of the frame, the diminishing perspective lines all pointing at him like a big X-Wing fighter, and it's just like, there he is. He's the badass. You've got Luke and the droids having a little conversation, and your eye instantly goes to them because of the framing. I don't know if you guys have heard of the thirds. We won't get into it, but that's a principle of design that creates an imbalance that helps lead the eye. So you've got them kind of on one of the thirds, and you've got the big land speeders, basically a big arrow saying, hey, look at them. But now, later days, I feel like there was a lot more preoccupation with design as cool, design as interesting, right? But not in service of the story. And so we have the probably most exciting meeting in the universe on the bottom left. And I don't know what they're talking about, taxes or something. And, who's where's the Darth Vader in this scene? Who's the power player? I don't know. I mean, who am I looking at? I'm not sure. There's some people in some chairs here and there, and they're all kind of symmetrical, and they're kind of wearing the same colors. They're kind of mirrored. And then you got, if you look closely enough, I think there's someone in that round shape, in that chair, I think, behind that bright window that's silhouetting them. And then, the most, wonderful what the fuck kind of staging on the right. I mean, what are you looking at? I mean, it's like cool blobby shapes, and we're going to have cool blobbies this and that and all the stuff, but there's no clear, idea of what your eye is taking in. So a couple of examples, Orson Welles, the master of composition, staging, leading the eye. Every shot is carefully composed. If you look at the camera angle so that the roof line is going right to Orson's head, and the cane banners coming in the other direction, he has all these arrows saying, look at him. Even the guy overlooking the balcony, there's a beautiful composition in terms of leading your eye and associating things like, you're leading the eye and you're prioritizing information. You're looking at him. He's looking at the stage down below at Kane. And then you're creating meaning. There's meaning is sort of created with careful kind of visual storytelling. A couple of other contemporary examples, classic Exorcist 3 for all of you who've seen it. Very simple shot. These are very simple, again, textbook tricks, but they work. They help clarify things. You have a priest sitting at a desk. You've got this giant light framing him or kind of pointing at him. You've got the cross up on the wall being lit by some mysterious window. But it's just right away, it gives your brain a chance to kind of go, oh, I get it. Got it. I got the information. It's kind of all you need. It's like that visual shorthand. Slingblade, another fine example. You've got him standing silhouetted in the doorway. Silhouettes look spooky. He's got a hammer. You can't really see the hammer, but hey, you can sure as hell see its shadow framed nicely on the door. And they kind of put the lamp behind him to kind of motivate that. Like, totally cheated, but it works. And then you got this sort of foot, this sort of cool foot in the foreground of someone asleep who's going to get it. So it's wonderful visual storytelling. So some examples. I'm going to pick on some competitors a little bit and brag about Pixar, because that's my job. But no, these are a couple of interesting examples. So Robots is a film where I think it's got some amazing design work in it. I mean, beautifully intricate designs. But when you watch the movie and when you look at, you compose almost any shot in that film, and they look like this, where it's all this visual interest, and you don't know what you're looking at. You don't know, your brain doesn't know how to parse the information. The first shot, top left, is introducing the main character and his little sidekick. What are you looking at? I mean, there's like stuff around him. He's got something on his head. There's some graphics on the wall. And bear in mind, I mean, I'm cherry picking these a bit, and you're looking at these as a still image, which is unfair. But again, there's a lack of thinking in terms of how to use tools, the tools at their disposal, lighting, composition, depth of field, what have you, to clarify what the brain is getting. The middle shot, they're introducing the Robin Williams character. And he's sort of a red robot against a red sort of thing in the background. There's all this complicated shapes. You don't know what you're looking at. The stuff in the background is more interesting than he is. And then, a really egregious case, there's this playful curly-Q character drinking out of a curly-Q straw in front of a curly-Q couch with some other curly-Q shapes in there. And it just becomes this blend of complexity, which is a shame because, again, all those designs are really beautiful. Like, I love pouring through the book, but my brain has a hard time parsing the information while watching the movie. Pixar, and I put the Pixar examples here just because it's not to say Pixar is better than anyone else, but Pixar, working with these guys, they are so anal about everything in the shot in terms of where is the eye going? What's the first thing the eye looks at? What's the second thing? What's the third thing? How are we supporting the story? How are we adjusting? Make this thing a little bit brighter, just so that it's a little bit brighter than this thing, so your eye goes to that first. Or we've got Bob with all this busy shit in front of him. How do we distill that down to feel like one big visual statement? Not all these competing billboards like in WALL-E, but just sort of one idea. And then you need to frame Bob and silhouette him so he pops against that. The monkey, those props and things are staged very carefully to basically point at him. It's like channeling Orson Welles. So the other important part of this, and I'll pull back out of the movies here, is it's really understanding the intent, the clarity of intent of what the story is trying to say. And films are inherently, good films are emotional. They emotionally engage you. So one of the best examples, classic examples, of how design serves emotion, serves story is Bambi. So Bambi is in one world. He doesn't go from Earth to space to wherever. He's like in his little spot in the woods. And what changes are the seasons. You have winter, spring, and maybe you have summer? I don't quite remember. But look at these things. So the top left, Bambi is just coming out of the den for the first time. And it's scary. Look at the scary shapes. I mean, I wouldn't want to go anywhere. Like anything there can kind of poke him. And so he goes out in the world, but it's not scary. It's wonderful. It's a winter wonderland. There's not a single shape there that can harm him. It's like a big, beautiful, billowy marshmallow world. And it's very pleasing and playful. But now you take that same world, and later on, they are running away from the hunters. And that same billowy marshmallow land is now this barren, flat, white landscape with this jagged lightning bolt cutting across it, which also foreshadows losing his mom. And I'm sorry if I gave that away. They bring her back in the sequel. So now it's springtime. They're back out again. And it's almost like they're all back to school together and reuniting with all the classmates. And again, look at that shape language. It's just like the billowy scene of coming out of the den. Soft forms, pillowy mushrooms, soft pastels. It's beautiful. But now, later on, there's a wildfire that's endangering everyone. And that same place he lives is now this jagged, fiery-colored, kind of scary, aggressive place. Later we get to see Bambi's absentee father looking on high from his office window and overlooking his young bucks. And he's there. He's actually there. He's a protector, but he's very much aloof from them. And so you're kind of establishing a distance. And then they're looking up at Bambi's dad. And he's on this majestic rock, and he's backlit. And your eye just says, badass deer on rock, right? There's no trees behind him. Like, if George Lucas had composed that in The Phantom Menace, there'd be like all kinds of robots and stuff all around him. But here it's just, he's backlit beautifully. There's nothing behind him. And it puts him in silhouette that kind of still makes him mysterious, and you've got this beautiful framing around him, drawing your eye in. So, another moment. Bambi is going to be joining his mom and friends. And again, we're back to this very playful, curvilinear, soft pastel shapes. And then the hunters come back. And now, in that same environment, now they're being pursued. And it's kind of like the jagged ice river previously. It's now this harsh, flat landscape, harsh shadow forms, hard white line cutting through it, them running away. And that's when Bambi's mom gets it. But good news is, Bambi fights off dogs, he fights off hunters and wildfires and, rival mates. And he becomes a man. He becomes the stud. And so what does that shot remind you of? Not in your own childhood, but up here. So if you look at the shot of the father, it's almost the exact same staging. And what they're doing, and that's not just chance. I mean, they're saying Bambi is becoming his father. He's not there yet. His rock isn't as big, but the rock's got to grow some more. But one thing that's interesting that's different about the shots is they didn't just mirror them, because one, that would be maybe obvious, too obvious. But also it's like Bambi is now against dark. His dad's against light, which backlights him and makes him like a silhouette and mysterious. Here, Bambi is lit. We see Bambi. We're still with Bambi. He hasn't gone, totally AWOL like his dad. A couple more examples. So this is sort of a lack of, I think, clarity of intent or a lack of emotional storytelling. Again, beautiful design work in these films, but there are certain opportunities that are sometimes missed or not stated as boldly as they could be. So Manny realizes he's the last mammoth on Earth. His species is extinct. I mean, that's pretty heavy stuff. I would be depressed if that was me. And this is sort of the moment where it's like, I'm all alone. It's sort of the spine of the whole movie. And how do they represent that? He goes up to these icicles and he's talking about it. And if you look closely, you'll see his reflections in the icicles. And I think that there's an attempt to have some kind of visual storytelling there. I think it's to basically say, look, there could be other mammoths, right? But it's such a small statement, and it doesn't really have the impact of like one of the most meaningful, probably, assertions in the film. And so, it's easy to kind of look back on it and pick it apart, and so I'll do that. But like, imagine if it was like a giant frozen waterfall. The sort of frozen rivulets, of water, sort of undulating, and and on one side he's standing in front of it alone, and you look in the reflection, and he's surrounded by an infinitude of reflections, like a herd of elephants. I mean, maybe that's over the top, a little overboard, but again, it's like thinking about how is the image serving the story. The bottom two shots are interesting because this is the montage moment where they walk from point A to point B, but there's like almost like emotional storytelling there that, when you think about Manny standing in front of the icicles having this heavy moment, it's a postcard perfectly beautiful day. And here, on the lower right, it's this somber blue kind of heavy moment that, how come maybe the weather could have been a little different or something, or there could have been like a shadow from the mountain or something, just to subtly adjust it. Now you can always go overboard, and when visual design becomes obvious, it doesn't work anymore. As a matter of fact, it has the opposite effect, because visual design is about kind of giving the audience cues to form their own feelings. And when you're being really obvious and making like a big arrow, or like if we have that shot, Manny's looking in the frozen waterfall with all the reflections, and it's raining, and there's lightning, and there's tears coming down the eyes of the elephants in the waterfall. Like, that would be like, come on, like, give me a break, because you're telling the audience how to feel instead of letting them feel for themselves, and that's a big no-no. So very quickly, because I know you guys actually want to hear about Dynamighty and CounterSpy, I think, right? So very quickly, so here's an example of a film. I don't know how many of you saw Guard State, but I'm going to ruin it for you. So basically, you have a guy who has no emotions, and his father's been medicating him since he's been a child, and he can't feel anything. And the film is his journey of learning how to have emotion. He lives in this all-white room. He drives a white car. He wears white clothes. The house he goes back to visit his father's house. There's no color there. Color represents, in this movie, a lack of color represents a lack of life. His father's office, his father in the upper right, glass, metal, cold, delicate, brittle. That's saying a lot about the father without even him saying, I'm cold and brittle. The character goes about seeing his old friends, trying to live with them. He's disconnected. He can't engage. And he's surrounded by all this color. But then he meets perky Princess Amidala wearing this wonderful little orange jumpsuit. And she's giddy and bubbly and happy. She takes him home. Her house is orange. She's got habit trails everywhere because they're orange. She's got orange curtains and orange blankets. And, they even go to the little cemetery where there's orange. And she's happy and she's sad, and she represents the full spectrum of emotion. And she kind of becomes his guide for getting in touch with his emotions. They go on this crazy journey together. It's traumatic. They all hate each other. They think they're going to be bumped off by a drug dealer in this crazy boat. The door opens up. It's this smiling guy with a baby in a big orange room. Like, he is safe. Come on, orange. That's a good color. Everyone's wearing orange. And then at the end of the movie, he learns to feel. And we know that because what's he wearing on the escalator there? He's wearing orange. And you notice, though, she's not wearing orange anymore. She finally changed her clothes. And there's no other color in that shot. That's not to say that everybody else in the world has lost feeling. But rather, if she was wearing orange and he was wearing orange, one, it would either be too obvious, or it would compete with the idea that he has changed. He is the character that has to change. The story is about his change. The color design reflects his change. So having no other color there really helps to sort of emphasize it's about him. And he's happy and they're united. So coming back to this, Phantom Menace versus Sideways. All right, how many of you know the answer now? Okay. The only thing I'm going to say about Sideways, so Phantom Menace is about cool, interesting designs. There's details everywhere. Even if you look at that shot, what are you looking at? If you squint your eyes, what are you looking at? If you put your glasses on, what are you looking at? There's all this visual detail where the heads are. You can't see anyone's eyes. There's visual stuff going on behind them. There's no sense of hierarchy. There's no sense of where your eyes should go. But it all looks neat, The only thing I'll say about Sideways, it's about wine. The main character is a grape. He starts off blue, and he gradually becomes more purple at the end. That's design. Okay, so Dynamighty. We're running low on time, and this is the bulk of my talk, so I'm going to power through. So I'm going to skip all this stuff about. So I want to do something different. I kind of knew films. I didn't really know games. I used to be addicted to Civilization before my wife made me throw it away. I'd been lucky enough to catch, the CD-ROM wave and catch the Pixar wave. I was there for a long time. I wanted to do something different, and now core games were coming to mobile. Next, great. David Nottingham reached out to me, who was founding Dynamighty with John Elliott and Mark Gurman, and they needed some art help. And so I thought, great, this will be fun. So, I'll skip that. Come on, guys, catch up. So what did we have? So they wanted to make a game about Cold War espionage, an action game, a side-scroller. They had kind of initial touchstones were Bond, Michael Caine, Funeral in Berlin. And the game itself, I'll do really quick. Whoa, stop, what happened? Can I play this? No, I can't. All right, no movie. So imagine that guy moving. That's the game. And so, there's potential here. I love the era. I mean, it was kind of a close cousin to the work on The Incredibles. But how do I turn this into something original and compelling? So I did my usual process. I did some R&R. So research and reference. So first, it's like, what's the genre? Who else? What are other examples of the genre? What do people like about the genre? What's the audience expectation? What are the touchstones and the conventions? And what's that core spy fantasy? The things you do in that world. So kind of like pulling those ideas. And I'm not a gamer, and so I wanted to figure out how do I turn that handicap into a strength. So bringing an outsider perspective and making a game that would appeal to me, not as a gamer, but say as an artist or someone who appreciates mid-century architecture or spy movies. So doing inspirational shotgunning and going wide beyond the context of it. It's like, I wanted the game to feel like it came from the era. I didn't want it to feel like we were parodying it or doing like kind of copying something else that was copying the era. So I went to source material. Being a graphic designer, I looked at a lot of graphic reference. And a set designer, I looked at a lot of architecture. I looked at movies and motion graphics and anything, sculpture, artwork, anything I could. Just to find my own touchstones that would be from the period that would infuse the game and give it some originality. And the other thing is like finding out, sometimes you can find out what something is by finding out what it isn't. So we loved Kevin Dart. Kevin Dart's work is amazing. But we didn't want to copy him. I mean, there's no point. But we love the same source material, so we had, again, find our own entry into the source material where we had our own path. Bond is the obvious starting point, so Bond I didn't want to work from. I wanted this to feel like CounterSpy was a franchise that was made and came out the same time as the Bond franchise did in the beginning, but Bond killed it. And only now is it being, unearthed out of someone's garbage can. Oh, CounterSpy, cool. And we also didn't want to parody the 60s. We wanted to have fun with it, but we wanted to be still respectful and earnest about it. A lot of the game was about trying to find the voice, the tone of the game. We found that with Dr. Strangelove. Dr. Strangelove was so ridiculous. It's like World War III, everyone's going to die, but no one cares, because it's about the sort of the machinery of war, and they're just, it's like they're doing their job. And it's a satire, but it's played so dry and so serious, with the exception maybe of Peter Sellers, that there's an earnestness to it where it's not like obviously being a comedy. And we liked that, so we wanted to have the same kind of earnestness to our game. And we also love the irony of the Cold War, where, this is a delicate subject matter, and I'm sure we offended more people than who, liked the game. Because we're caricaturing an important part of history. But we didn't want the game to be about history. It's a shooter, right? You're running around shooting people in the head. We want to have this setting and a certain kind of fantasy to it. And we wanted it to be about ideas and not about the events. Like, we're not, again, making a historical statement. The irony that we liked, that David and I responded to, was that you had two sides, east and west, and you can have your favorites, and they were so afraid of each other. They were so threatened by each other. They stockpile massive arms, this massive arms race that can blow the world up 1,000 times over. And so we were wanting to look back on that and kind of say that was scary and silly. And so the game is kind of playing with those ideas. The style, which is interesting, people again asked about the style. So we're and just stopping the train for a second, we're probably going to totally run out of Q&A time. I'm going to power through here, but I know there's an overflow room, so you guys can follow me like little ducklings, and we can talk more. So the style didn't come, I didn't come in and say, here's the style. I know exactly what we're doing. And I don't think style works that way. I think style should come from constraint and context. So we had a small team, very small team. We had a small budget. We had time constraints. And we had the burden of creating all this content. So having a really heavy, detailed style just would be impossible for us to create content for with the resources we had. We had multiple platforms with small displays. You'd be playing it outside because it was for mobile. You have light pollution, different performance ranges for the devices. So we needed, again, a visual style that was going to be performance, not performance heavy, and would read when you're on the bus playing. And there's the context of the genre, kind of getting a sense of the fantasy and the fiction of that spy genre. And then the team, what are our strengths and interests, background, aesthetics, what have you. So going reductive, we had a reductive style. That was sort of the logical conclusion. We could make it quickly. It had better legibility, less performance hit. It's distinctive, and it kind of played to my own graphic sensibility. There's a lot of reference in here, so let's just skip through here. So again, finding the world. What are cool places to have gun battles in, to sneak around in? The first stuff I did was, originally the game was going to be 2D, a 2D side-scroller, and we were kind of talking about it being painted looking. So we did some early tests, and then I began working in SketchUp. I didn't really know how to 3D model, after my time at Pixar. So I was using SketchUp to kind of pre-visualize things, and also I wanted to nudge more back into 3D, and so we were trying out different things. Kind of bringing in the ingredients. We're looking at, I still loved Ken Adams' architecture, even though I said no to Bond. We said yes to Ken Adam, the production designer. And then trying to find, again, graphically reductive shapes and visual clarity. And then we tied it together. We kind of did our first demo. I had the help of two production artists, Sean Murphy and Rezvan Luda, who helped, basically were my helpers to put this together, because I was just kind of incompetent from a production standpoint, and probably still am to some degree. So we built this first demo, and this is what got us funding with Sony. And you can see there was some hints of color progression. There was still that strong silhouetted framing of space, some bold graphic signage, deep spaces and things that kind of stayed with the game as it evolved. But there was still poor visual clarity. You had a hard time seeing the character on screen, and just didn't know what to say yet stylistically. We moved around a lot between going to big, sort of larger, more complex spaces to more modular spaces. I took more of a modular approach, trying to build rooms out of basic Lego blocks. But they ended up looking the same and kind of characterless, non-distinct. So then we thought, okay, well, let's put a little more story into the rooms and have them be more unique spaces that say something. Like instead of the room with the red thing next to the blue thing, it's the big wind tunnel with the big jet in it. Sort of having visual stories. But it's still a little cluttered, but it's inching along. But we had a big gaping hole that the style of the game wasn't coalescing yet, because we didn't really have a character. When I started, some of the early character concept work was much cartoonier on the left. It was cartoony, it was playful, and to me it just felt tonally inconsistent with kind of how the tone was evolving. But also it was really hard to read on a small device because basically it was just a head floating around against dark backgrounds. So we needed to kind of and I'm not a character artist, we needed help. So we circled back, who's our character? There was a lot of debate, is he going to be a full-fledged character with a backstory and a middle name, or is he going to be this sort of enigmatic character that the player can project their own imagination into? And that kind of debate never fully settled. But, we did settle on the fact that, okay, this guy, he's sort of an intellectual badass. He's McQueen, and he's Michael Caine. He's not Stallone or Schwarzenegger. David Nottingham, the creative director of the company and the creative director of the game, one of the things he's amazing at is just he's inspirational, and he's really good at just reaching out to people and pulling them in. And so we were really inspired by Robert Valley's art, and David's like, okay, I'll get him. So we reached out to him, they hit it off, and Robert ended up doing some work with us. We finally had a character. It was taking shape. It was graphic. It was cool. It was bold, edgy, and still kind of playful. But Robert was a freelancer, and he was an illustrator, and the designs they were exciting and inspirational, but they weren't production ready. So enter Nathan Sisler, a former student. Nathan came in and worked with us in-house and did amazing work, polishing the character, refining it, defining features, making it, giving it strong posing, strong silhouettes, so our animator Chris McGovern could bring strong poses to it, very distinct, recognizable poses. And so we had our guy, we had our hero, and we needed a bad guy, and we basically had a cast of two. Our budget was was pretty tight. So for the bad guy, a couple ideas. One, we wanted to be, because we were constrained, we also wanted to be kind of ironic here. And basically say you got the East and the West, and they're basically two sides of the same coin. They're two warring factions, paranoid and afraid of each other, and putting the whole world at risk in a crazy arms race to blow up the moon. So we found this amazing reference, early propaganda sculpture from the Soviet-era sculpture, and Nathan just hit it out of the park. And the designs on the right, that guard, was like, that's our style. And that came back to start to inform, just really tell us what we needed to be. So the pieces were coming together. We had this sort of simple kind of, angular iconic world, these angular characters, but it was still just lacking some sophistication I couldn't bring to it. So then I told Nathan to sick the sets. Sick it, boy. And he went and he brought his design thinking to the sets and going bold, just thinking exciting ideas and playing with scale and shape and pattern. And just bringing the kind of characterization to the spaces, these big monolithic brutalist spaces, and distinct sort of stories in them. And they're very memorable. And in a way that it framed the character in the gameplay without really upstaging it or complicating it. Even we're trying okay, what's the whole world look like? We actually had a lot of exterior sets we ended up not using in the game, but trying to come up with that super, how does the world look, the natural world look with this graphic reductive quality? So we had all the pieces, but it was concept art, and it's really, the concept art's a means to an end, and the end is the game, the interactive world of the game itself. And I didn't have really much production experience in games, and it couldn't really take shape and work until someone could build it. So Bob Archibald came on, our master set builder, and he took over. Not only did he have to rebuild all the broken stuff I made, he set up a whole new pipeline, workflow, asset library, worked with the designers on a constantly evolving gameplay metrics and mechanics and level designs, and then he gave me the tools to build rooms that I could inform the style. So, in the time it might take me to build these rooms, like I just kit bash the stuff, and okay, maybe it's like this, and the Soviets are like this, and the Western guys are like that, or what have you. They're sloppy. You couldn't even barely use them in the game. And that time, Bob would make these really complex rooms with actual gameplay action in them. And he would make more. and he made more, and he made more, and he made so many more that I couldn't even put in here, and a lot of them even didn't make it into the game. And so this was an amazing amount of work. And in the end, the style of the game, we weren't able to really hit the ambition and the scope of the concept art, unfortunately. There were a lot of compromises we had to make. But Bob ended up making really smart compromises that created a consistent style. It was cohesive, it was functional, it was clear. And I could totally ignore the world of sets. And that freed me up to move on to all the other disparate parts of the game, sort of the connective tissue, the sort of the graphic wrapper of the game. So there was, and that's sort of, there's propaganda, messaging, user interface. Let me just jump into here. So again, reference, blah, 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 you know the drill. Initial menu design, this was for a keynote presentation, but it was like you can see where I'm kind of playing with period colors and shapes, and even like the TV edging. I wanted this to feel like a TV show or something, again, like a larger franchise, not just a game. And I wanted to know, well, what would the stores put up? I mean, what is this game we're making? Because we were looking at it from the inside out, and I wanted to take a minute, take a step back, and look outside in. So, like, what would a teaser poster look like? So I did a teaser poster. And then that began to kind of inspire, like, the branding, the colors, the palette, the shapes. And that really began to define kind of some of the visual language, even like iconography and typefaces. So that now kind of brought that back into the menus. I wanted to keep this forward slant feeling, the italicized fonts, edgy black and white and red, having these, working with Nate with having these really bold, simple graphic shapes in the HUD, and really just have strong branding. It began to evolve, as it always does. This is probably 1/1000th of the work of menu designs that I did. I could do a whole 4-hour talk on those. But you can still see sort of the ideas, like I'm like holding on to the slant, like it's got to be slanted. That's the game, and it ends up that was really hard to implement. So then I'm like, okay, fine, So we straightened it out, and I leaned on sort of the golden ratio, which was certain aspects, design aspects that were used a lot in period design. So I began to do kind of golden ratio, kind of proportioned panels. And kind of playing with, and I like the idea of being on white or being on off-white, so it looked like it was printed on paper. Going on black was, to me, like a digital thing. Like, it just said computer, and I wanted to be, not digital, I wanted to be analog. But when we played the game up on the big flat screen, you're like doing this because of all the white, so we ended up going black. We also, the red colors competed with the idea that we recognized Soviets as being red. And so we had red counter and red Soviets. It was kind of confusing. So I finally begrudgingly agreed to change the color of counter as well, and went for more kind of an aqua blue with a red accent and black and white, and then red for Soviets, and then the Western stuff was more blue-green, was more like a navy blue and green. So you can see how the design choices, the grid the changing of the grid, shapes, colors began to inform all the HUD elements. There were, again, millions of these. But then also there's sort of like, having those in the bag now, it kind of, well, I mean, and I'm totally glossing this stuff over. There was like, visual clarity is of utmost importance to any kind of interactive design, I'm sure most of you know. And so having things be clear, you almost have to be able to understand what's happening even peripherally without looking at it. Because you're focusing on the gameplay, you're focusing on doing something. You don't want to be having to look at the HUD for visual information. It's almost like the information just has to come to you. So there was a lot of work in terms of balancing, and it was effective in some ways, and there's lots of learning that I got from that. But then there's sort of the storytelling. We didn't have a budget for dialogue. We didn't have a budget for backstory. So how do we kind of tell the story of this kind of world and this sort of irony without that? So again, my graphics background really lent itself. So we could basically have the equivalent of billboards everywhere, and that fits within these spaces. Because it's propaganda. They're kind of like, again, creating fear to kind of justify sort of I don't want to oversimplify it, but in our game, kind of creating the sort of fear-mongering to create incentive for sort of the militarization and sort of this arms race. But I wanted to show there's two sides, and they're sort of opposing forces, but they're kind of, again, two sides of the same coin. And I want to do it in a playful way. Ironically, when you think of the Soviets, you think of them as masters of propaganda. And they were beautiful at it. Beautiful brainwashing. But you know what? The U.S. is pretty good at it too, actually. And ironically, the comedic voice ended up coming from a lot of the civil defense stuff. Warning. Oh, out of time. Awesome. Okay. So let's see what else I got here. So I'm going to skip through this stuff and wrap it up. So just there, with the graphics, I want to have a consistent continuity to design so that the illusion, the fantasy doesn't change. It doesn't break. Even the graphics, the visual effects needed to be graphic and playful and not realistic. The visual storytelling and the cinematics, I wanted to evoke Saul Bass and have it feel like a TV opener. And then the fun part was sort of, again, the kind of the branding, larger branding of the world, making this game feel like it came from something historical, like it was, based on an old movie. So I did a lot of like these sort of promotional art, movie posters. We actually printed a vinyl album with the soundtrack. These are the books below that the game was based on, the sort of the series of novels. We did trading cards. So that's pretty much it. I won't go too much. So, Dynamighty is an awesome place to work. We had a great time building the school culture. And, but, this is sort of a story of change, too, and my change. So keep an eye out for CounterSpy, so from Dynamighty. Keep an eye out in the App Store pretty soon. You might be seeing something else coming out soon. And also, CounterSpy is now free on PS Plus. So for those of you who don't have it yet, go and you have PlayStation hardware, go play it. And for me, I recently left Dynamighty. I went to a small Mountain View company to help them kind of expand in some new directions. And that's how I'll end it. So there you go. Thank you.